Okay, welcome to the show, everyone. This is the Innovative Schools podcast, and I'm your host, Robbie Lamb. Today, I'm joined by Jessica Sinarski. Jessica is a thought leader in connecting neuroscience with practice in adult and child relationships. Jessica has trained thousands of parents and professionals and maintains a private practice where she incorporates neurofeedback and attachment-based therapeutic models. Jessica founded Brave Brains to help others experience the hope and healing that is possible with a deeper understanding of the brain. She has created a framework based on the concepts introduced in her children's book titled Rewiring the Brain that is improving outcomes for those affected by ACEs and trauma. Jessica, thank you so much for being with us today.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I've attended several of your trainings and I've learned so much. And, one of the main takeaways I've had from watching your training and attending them is, why didn't I learn any of this in school? It's so important.
Yeah.
They're great life skills and strategies that really people of all ages can use. And it's just amazing that not just in higher education for teachers, but just in education for all of us, we didn't really learn a lot about the brain. And, the more I've learned about it, the more I've realized how beneficial that can be. So I was curious, what made you want to get or want to focus specifically on helping teachers and educators help their students learn about the brain? What kind of got you into that area?
So I really enjoy getting to start young. A lot of the resources that I've created so far kind of track for early childhood education, elementary school, because the sooner that kids can learn about their brains and that the adults around them can learn about the brain and filter interpreting behavior through that brain-based model, the better the trajectory. Like we can shift that trajectory early.
Mm.
And from the mental health side of things, like I'm not a teacher in the classroom. And so I don't know pedagogy and I don't know the best curriculum for X, Y, and Z and all of those things. But I do know that all of those pieces will go better if we all know how our brains work and how our kids' brains work. And so that's what I kept running into in IEP meetings. And as I would do workshops, there was just such a thirst for this information. And so that has continued to be a focus as I have been out there under the umbrella of Brave Brains.
Awesome, great. And we're going to talk more about Brave Brains and your book, Rewiring the Brain, a little bit later on. So let's get into it. This is going to be fascinating. I'm so excited to speak with you about this. On the topic of, what do educators need to know about the brain? What's the first thing? Where can we start? What's sort of Brain 101? What do we need to know?
Okay, Brain 101. Hold up your hand, fold over your thumb, and close your fist. This is your brain, and not the 80s commercial version of this is your brain on drugs. Any questions?
Right.
I had a lot of questions at that point. So this is your brain. Your fingers are this good human prefrontal cortex. This is where all academics happen, and your social approach, your connectedness, all of those rich things that we hope are developing in children, that all happens in this upstairs brain, okay? Your other operating system is your downstairs brain. It's your brain stem. It's your limbic system. It's really deep inside the brain. It's the home of big feelings of fight or flight, freeze, even when kids sort of shut down. I think of that like the hoodie that's sort of covering the faces. I'm not opposed to hoodies. I love hoodies. But when you see those kids tucking in, that might be a freeze response. It might not just be them trying to flip you the bird. It might be that brainstem freeze response, that self-protectiveness. And your thumb in the middle here is your amygdala. And your amygdala is this teeny tiny part of your brain deep inside that acts as the fire alarm. So it's the smoke detector, I guess. And for some kids, it functions really well, and it just goes off when there really is a fire and they really need that downstairs brain fight, flight, freeze involved. For most of us, though, we have to work on our amygdalas a little bit. We get false alarms. We get cranky about things that really aren't a big deal. And so what happens, especially for kids who've experienced early life trauma, so abuse, neglect, maybe chronic stress of poverty, maybe some mental health issues in the home, all of those experiences mean that their brain is wiring for defense, that it's wiring for solo survival. And that's adaptive. That's not, that's actually a really protective thing that our brains do. But it means that in the classroom, it's going to be harder for them to keep that upstairs brain operating system online. And I just think if we pull the like motivation and shame out of thinking about the brain and behavior, man, we start to see some differences.
And the way I understand it, and please correct me if I'm wrong, you can either be operating from your downstairs brain, which is more reactive, more volatile, more angry, more defensive, or you can be operating from your upstairs brain, which is, I think I've heard you say before, like calm and curious, right?
Yeah,
Or fast and furious. So
that's right.
is it right that you're either in one or the other? You can't be in both. Is that accurate?
That's exactly right. So that's a really tricky thing because it's state dependent. Like your behavior, every human behavior is state dependent. It's either coming from this calm, curious, connected, social connected upstairs brain, or it's coming from fight, flight, freeze, from fast, furious, or frozen. Now this one is a little bit on a dimmer switch, so you can have a little prickliness, a little bit of that, or you can be throwing chairs and swearing, and it can be big. You can be a little bit shut down and like non-responsive, or you can be completely in your turtle shell and really need some help getting out. So yes, we are state dependent creatures. We are either in our upstairs brain or downstairs brain. And that's true for adults as well. This isn't just a kid thing, right? So I have 3 boys, and they all in their own ways know how to push my buttons. And it's not because they're mean, they're delightful children, but I have learned so much about this interpersonal neurobiology stuff in parenting, because I will find myself flipping into my downstairs brain over something that in the scheme of things is really not that big a deal. But it hits that emotional part of me that maybe makes me feel like a failure as a mom, or that my kid's going to be going to college and still not be able to get themselves dressed in the morning, right? Like it's hitting. And so those things can happen as educators or counselors as well, that we start to flip as we feel like we're losing control, or feel like we're failing, right? That narrative starts to come into our brain and flip that into our reactive power and control downstairs brain, which doesn't help calm another. Like if our kid in our class is flipping and we're flipping, no, there's no brain regulation happening here, right? So yeah.
And I want to get into speaking about some triggers here in a moment, but the more I've learned about this, it's fascinating, this whole upstairs brain, downstairs brain, fast and furious, calm and curious. I think it's important to know, like, that's not just a metaphor. You can hook somebody up, from how I understand this, you can hook somebody up to some kind of, EKG machine or whatnot, or fMRI machine, actually, I think. And you can see the areas of the brain light up when certain things are happening to them. So the metaphors are helpful, and they're easy. They help us remember these things. But it's actually true. When you're angry, the part of your brain that's activated, scientifically proven, is the lower part of your brain. And when you're
That's
more
right.
inquisitive and you're in a good relation, a good relational setting and whatnot, the parts of your brain that are activated are different. So
That's right.
and it's fascinating, and we can kind of get into triggers here in a moment, but if a student is reacting a certain way in a classroom and you're trying to reason with them, but if they're clearly in downstairs brain, they're not going to be able to process your more conceptual kind of ideas you're trying to get across. Like their brain literally cannot function that way. Is that right?
Yes. So you just said the magic word reason. Like if you're trying to reason with an unreasonable brain, right? Reason doesn't live down here in the downstairs brain. Reason is up here. And so what we want to do are things when we see a lid flipping, is things that help bring safety, help bring calm. We're trying to soothe that little amygdala. I actually did a workshop for innovative schools on amygdala soothing because it's just such an important part of of functioning in a classroom, especially right now in the middle of a pandemic. But anytime that we can send messages of safety, both to ourselves and our brains and bodies, as well as to our kids, they're gonna do their times tables better. They're going to engage in class discussion better. They're gonna be able to sit in their seat, or maybe they need to stand because sitting is too restrictive for their bodies. They need to move a little bit more. And so a little movement sends some safety signals to them so that they can concentrate, so that their upstairs brain can hug their amygdala
Right.
and stay engaged for all of the wonderful things that we as educators want them to be able to do. You know, they don't want to come in and make your life miserable, but it sure feels like it sometimes,
Right.
you know?
So I want to talk about some triggers here now, but kind of just to recap what we've talked about so far, what do educators need to know about the brain? I guess first point, upstairs brain and downstairs brain. Secondly, we are state dependent. And so depending on what part of the brain you're in, it's going to have a huge influence on how you're behaving. And so now I want to get into triggers. Can you speak about sort of triggers generally? I think we all kind of know basically what they
Sure.
are, but the more that I've been reading this in preparation for this conversation with you, the brain's ability to sort of rewire itself and how just triggers are formed in general is fascinating. So could you just speak a little bit about triggers so we can kind of
Sure.
understand how powerful those truly can be?
Absolutely. So, we've talked before about how something may have happened in a child's past, and maybe the person was wearing the color red, and so suddenly a shirt with the color red or just the color red can send a little danger signal to that amygdala, because our amygdalas, especially if we've experienced unsafe settings, get very sensitized. It's trying to keep you alive. And so it's going to be, instead of just smelling smoke far away, instead of just smelling smoke up close, it's trying to detect the smoke a mile away, right? I had a kid once who told me, we were talking through some stuff. He was trying to figure out how to get his upstairs brain to be in charge more in safe settings, but he had lived in some really unsafe settings. And so when he had developed this skill, it's incredible, that he could smell when a gun came out. Now,
Wow.
I'm a white girl who's lived in pretty safe settings my whole life, and I didn't need that skill, right? I haven't been in an environment when I needed that skill. That skill helped keep him alive. His amygdala connected to his sensory system so that he could smell danger, literally. And so what he was trying to do, in his teenage years and early adulthood, was figure out, okay, what settings do I need that to be on? And when can I not? Which relationships are safe and which aren't? Which environments are safe and which aren't? Man, what a fantastic upstairs brain exercise he's going through. And so for our little ones, they don't necessarily have words for that, right? So as I'm thinking of the teachers listening right now who are like, I can't know the color red or the,
Right.
whatever the triggers are for every
Yeah,
student in my class.
exactly.
Of course not. Of course you can't. And that's not realistic, right? So take a
Right.
breath, let your upstairs brain come back online, because you don't have to. What you can start doing is incorporating just other things that build felt safety in the classroom environment, a culture of safety in your classroom, in your school, right? For administrators who are listening right now, that one of our primary focal points should be calming amygdalas, to let brains and bodies be calm so that we can engage. And it's confusing because sometimes brains and bodies being calm means that they need to move more, not less, right?
Yeah, right. It sort of goes, yeah, you want somebody to be calm, but we're going to get into some strategies here in a minute, but I know some of the strategies to calm a brain are actually to like excite the body. And so
Yeah.
it could look a little different. But that's, that story you told about that child who could smell a gun, I think it's just like jaw dropping. But I think it's a great it's a great point you're making and a great example, you know, because it demonstrates how the brain itself rewires itself to safety, right? And I
Yeah,
know not everybody listening to this, obviously, but I know in some of the broader conversations we have as society now, the word trigger gets put out there a lot.
yeah,
And some folks might say, well, they're just being too sensitive, or they need to grow up, or they need to toughen up, or whatever. And I know educators as a whole probably don't think that way, but broadly speaking, I know those comments get made. But I think the important part of this is, these are subconscious sort of triggers a lot of times, and not only are subconscious, the brain itself, right? The brain
that's
has
right.
rewired itself quite literally to protect itself based on whatever, uh, some element that was present in a traumatic moment, and that can be anything from a color to a word to somebody's tone of voice. It can. The way I've heard about trauma is when a traumatic event happens, your brain takes a snapshot, and everything in
Yeah.
that snapshot becomes a potential danger.
Right. And it's not contextualized. So that's the other thing,
Exactly.
especially
Right.
with chronic trauma. It's not put in the context of time and space. Your hippocampus, your memory storage
Mhm.
shrinks and your amygdala grows. Like there's
Mm.
literally it's fascinating. I was just looking back at some old research on this, not that old. um, it's a brain thing. I feel like most of my talks could be titled like, he's not trying to be a jerk or you're not a bad person. You're just working from the wiring that your brain developed. And the good news is we can rewire brains.
Mhm.
That's my whole mission, is to
Mm.
help equip adults and kids to rewire their brains. Because I talked about the upstairs brain and downstairs brain operating systems. And so really what our focus is where are the highways? Because our brain lays down these literally these myelinated, these sort of insulated wires in our brain. That's what our neurons put
Mhm.
together. And we are either wiring for calm, curious connection, or we are wiring for survival. We're wiring for self-protection. And it doesn't feel good to the adults in our lives, but it's adaptive, right? So it doesn't feel good if somebody throws a tantrum because you're wearing a red shirt. You don't know that it's because you're wearing a red shirt,
Right.
but it's not. They're not trying to be mean, and it doesn't even have to be that. It can just be like the nervous system just sort of gets heightened. So it doesn't even have to be a red shirt. It's just that I'm running here. I feel like the pandemic has opened a lot of people's eyes to what that sort of chronic heightened arousal feels like, or
Mm.
depressed arousal. So that freeze response that most of the kids that I work with are experiencing their whole lives. So whatever, if you've noticed that in yourself living through this pandemic, imagine that chronically. Imagine that being your entire, like not knowing any different. Ooh, it's intense. And it really amps up the level of, um, it pulls the shame and intentionality back from it. Like maybe you're snapping at your partner a little bit more, or maybe you have a little less patience for your kids, or a little less energy for learning new things, right? As your admin team is telling you to learn 1,700 new things. I get it, right? Um, that's what's going on in a brain that's experienced a high number of adverse childhood experiences or trauma. It's not your job to heal all the trauma. So
Mhm.
again, I just want to relieve you of that burden. I'm training therapists as well. So there are more therapists out there doing this kind of work, but we can apply this to the classroom. And so that's
Mhm.
really my hope when I work with educators. It's not to turn you into a therapist. It's to help you tune into where you are in your brain and body and where your students are in their brain and body, so we can regulate that. Because if you spend 30 seconds regulating that, you'll have a much more productive 14.5-minute math lesson,
Mhm. Yeah, I kind
right?
of exactly, and I want to get into some of those classroom strategies. So great transition on your end, because that's where I wanted to get to. So now that we kind of have a general understanding of the brain, the ability is just amazing ability to rewire itself for protection or for safety. How triggers are formed, and that they're not just sort of emotional triggers, or actually hardwired into the brain in some cases. in a child's their higher their ACEs score, or maybe the more difficulty that they've had growing up, or in their current situation, that can limit their ability to operate in their upstairs brain. So knowing all of that, that's great information for everybody to know, classroom teachers especially. Knowing all that, where can we begin to speak to our students about the brain? How can we talk to them about the brain? And the brain can be kind of complicated using big words, right? Like you're just talking neuroplasticity and neurons and all this, right? That can be very complicated, especially for our younger students. So where do you recommend teachers start, or how can they start speaking to their students about the brain?
I think I'm seeing more and more educators doing this, so that's really exciting. And there are a number of different things out there to explain it. I think this hand model, the house model, that upstairs downstairs, is just so easy to grab onto. For your older students, you might also find thinking of it as operating systems. So your upstairs brain is a more updated operating system, where your downstairs brain is that older operating system that's really just trying to not crash. Like it's really just about, maybe it shuts down more because it's trying to not, or it sort of fights back, right? Like you get these unhelpful components in it. Yeah, these pop-ups, these
Pop-up
other
windows,
things.
yeah.
Yeah, you're like, no, not helpful. Right. So they're like those kinds of metaphors in the Riley the Brave books. I don't actually say the word brain in it, but you see these downstairs brain. Well, I do in the afterword for grownups, but in the story itself, I don't, because some of our kids with trauma can get really, it's a survival thing, can feel self-protective if you start talking about them or their brains. And so it can be easier to introduce it in animal form, like having a tiger moment or having a turtle moment, that seems to be an easier way for kids to grab onto it. So there's lots of ways. I would encourage you, I'm continuing to develop more ways to talk about this. So if you hop over to bravebrains.com and sign up for the newsletter, you'll get some of that information along the way. I'm making videos, and there's a bunch of free resources for educators on the site.
Great, and I'll make sure to share a link to just your website overall in the description, as well as, I know you have, as you mentioned, several sort of free resources on there where you've taken a lot of research and you've kind of simplified it into, kind of a 1 or 2 page document to kind of synthesize the main points that teachers need to know. I wanted to mention, again, the more I've learned, honestly, a lot from you and some of the other presenters that we have at the Innovative Schools Summit. It's been fascinating to learn about this because, as I mentioned, I never learned this in school or even in college, quite honestly. And it's been fascinating because, as you mentioned a few moments ago, the good news is we can change our states, right? Science has proven there are strategies out there that allow us to kind of re-regulate ourselves and move us into upstairs brain when we feel ourselves descending. So that's the good news, is we can change our mindsets, number one. And number two, just personally, but I think this would apply to other people, we as humans, we like mastery, right? We like to accomplish something and get better at things. So these strategies that we're going to get into in a few minutes, they're helpful to change your state, but the more you realize they work, sort of the more mastery you feel like you have over your brain. I think a lot of us think, well, I'm in a bad mood and so I'm going to operate this way, or so-and-so said something and now I'm angry. Whereas these strategies allow you, rather than your brain controlling you, you can kind of control your brain in a way and have mastery over, and which is just fascinating. And it's one of the reasons I wanted to have you on, because, that message needs to be out there more, right? We don't have to be victims of our circumstances always. We can have some influence in how we react to those things.
Right. I think of, so I think the danger sometimes with the discussion of ACEs is sort of this, oh, poor baby, but superheroes are born of adversity. They need connection to get there, right? So the villain stories usually have they're very similar backstories for a villain and a superhero. I love that stuff. I love superhero stuff.
Yeah.
But the villain didn't get the connection. They stayed in the orphanage, or they were bullied after they lost their parent, or those kinds of things, right? Whereas the superheroes, they had an uncle that came along that was safe for them, or they made, the power of one safe adult is
Mhm.
is huge as a preventive measure, because we are relational creatures, and for our brains to be well connected, we need to connect to another well-connected brain. We need relationship to be able to heal, especially to heal relational trauma.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm trying to look up a quote real quick. Actually, I read this in a book recently. This is from a book called The Body Keeps Score, which I highly recommend folks
Yes,
mention.
very good.
But it's a book all about how the brain rewires itself in traumatic environments and how you can use the body to help heal itself. But there's a quote in there that is really relevant to what you just said. The quote is, "The roots of resilience are to be found in the sense of being understood by and existing in the mind and heart of a loving, attuned, and self-possessed other." So,
Yeah.
as you just mentioned, it's fascinating that you're basically what it's saying is resiliency. A key component is resiliency is knowing that you're held in the mind of another person,
Yeah.
which is
Yeah.
fascinating and
Yes.
is exactly what you were just saying, right? The
Well,
hero.
and that's my hope
Mhm.
here. That's part of why I'm passionate about getting this word out to everyone, including educators, because I know your job is hard. It's next to impossible. I can't imagine. And so it can lead you to your downstairs brain naturally. Like
Mm.
that would be a natural place to go when you're feeling overwhelmed and stressed. And so when you're in your downstairs brain and a kid is in their downstairs brain, neither of you are holding each other well
Mm.
in your minds, right?
Mhm.
And so if I can help a little bit to empower those messages, if I can send those safety messages to you so that you can send those safety messages to your kiddo, that there's no such thing as a bad student. There are brains wired for defense that we're working on it, right?
Mhm.
And so we can catch those upstairs brain moments, because I promise every single student has them, and nurture those connections and highways in the brain. It's the impact is, breathtaking. It's really a
Mhm.
wonderful thing to behold.
Real quick, so we talked a lot about the brain, and you've shared some fascinating information with us. So, given everything that we've learned so far, what are some strategies you recommend that teachers can implement classroom-wide? As you mentioned, a teacher can't uh, know every student's trigger, and they can't help the
Yeah.
student solve every single one of their triggers. That's not necessarily their role, and it's just not possible to do that in a classroom full of 30 children. So, that said, what are some strategies a classroom teacher can implement? After they teach students about upstairs, downstairs brain and use age appropriate language,
Yep.
how can a teacher what are some strategies that teachers can implement and or teach their students to sort of help self-regulate themselves?
Yes. So I will keep this as succinct as possible, because I could talk about this forever. First things first, figure out where you are in your brain. So pause, take a breath. If you need to go to the cool down corner or tap out for a second, talk with your administration to put those systems in place, because a dysregulated brain cannot
Mm.
help regulate another brain. So we have to tune into ourselves. There's no shame in it, right? We all flip. We all have porcupine moments. So first, check in with yourself and your brain and body. The second thing I would say is connection before correction. So if you find yourself, this is especially true for the kid that pushes your buttons, and the one, right? You're listening to this and you're like, "Ooh, no, but he is a tiger. He is a bad student. I know it feels like it. I know it feels like it sometimes." But he's a brave cub. He's a brave kid trying to survive the best way that he knows how. And so holding some compassion in your head and choosing a little moment of connection before you go into correction. Another really helpful strategy is incorporating felt safety. So I'll hear teachers talk sometimes about using their teacher voice, using their stern, and it's usually accompanied with a furrowed brow and like a pointed finger.
Right.
And again, I say this with tremendous compassion. I get it. I do things as a mom I just never imagined I would, tones of voice and things that I never imagined I would do. However, for a child who's experienced trauma, even that furrowed brow can be interpreted as threat. So take a breath, muster some warmth in your eyes, even getting down on their level. So for your younger students, or for a student at a desk, it's a very different feeling to come in like this than it is to come in face to face. So those little body postural changes, those are tremendously important for reaching the downstairs brain and waking up the upstairs brain. Another strategy, and again, I could go on and on, so I'll stop with this. Well, two more. I'm going to give you two more. So one is play. Anytime you can incorporate just a little bit of playfulness, even if it's a silly video break or just little ways to incorporate some play. Play lives in the upstairs brain. So that is a fantastic way to wire that little brain that, oh, when I'm in school, there's some safety and connection and I can be calm and curious. So whenever you can do things in a playful way, that kudos. Lastly, think about all of the senses. So not just the 5 that we know of, but do some digging around on the vestibular sense and the proprioceptive sense, because kids need a lot more twisting, turning, swinging, bouncing, banging, crashing than they're getting these days, especially in this digital, time that we're doing so much digitally, virtually. So building in true brain breaks where we're moving our body, we're trying, maybe everybody gets around the classroom and tries to push down the wall. Let's push really hard. Oh, we didn't get it again. Okay, I guess we'll have to tiptoe to our seats and sit back down. The walls are still standing. I guess it's really safe in here, right? So you're filtering in a little felt safety, a little proprioceptive input, a little play, and that down regulating of tiptoeing to your seat so that you're ready for that calm, curious brain to be engaged.
I've heard you talk about that proprioceptive sense before, and that's fascinating. When I heard, you explain it one of your trainings, you mentioned everybody knows the senses of touch, sense, et cetera, but we have a sense of balance, which is what that proprioceptive sense is. And
so that's vestibular. The balance one's vestibular.
Okay,
that's okay.
I apologize. Complicated words. Thanks. But your vestibular sense, which, as you mentioned, is your sense of balance. That's a sense we don't really think about. But if you can, correct me if I'm wrong here, but the way I understood it, and I've tested it on myself and it seems to work, if you can play with your sense of balance, all of a sudden your body has to pay attention to how balanced you are, and it can't think about, some trigger or it's more difficult for it to be in fear or whatever, because it has to pay attention to how balanced you are. And so all of a sudden you're the way I think of it, you're sort of forcing that brain out of, fight, flight, or freeze, and you're forcing it to pay attention to your balance. And even so, it's like an instant trigger to bring you back to.
It can definitely be a here and now, sort of pulling yourself back to the here and now, as opposed to, because trauma triggers send us to the past. Yeah, that's great. And especially for our young ones, they need lots of experiences of twisting and turning and swinging and bending and crawling, and those all literally lay the foundations of your brain. Your sensory system is how your brain takes in all information. And so if that's a little out of whack, we've got kids who are super dysregulated.
Awesome. So that's great. As you mentioned, you could talk about this for hours. I personally could talk about it all day with you as well.
Yes.
But I know you have to get out of here in a few minutes. So real quick, I wanted to mention, allow you to talk a little bit more about, as I mentioned at the top, I know you have a book titled Rewiring the Brain that's actually being re-released. I think it was re-released last week, actually. There you go. So tell us real quickly about Rewiring the Brain and where folks can find it if they're interested in getting a copy.
Sure. So Rewiring the Brave is, it's the little cub with big feelings. It is a really engaging picture book story, and you can find it wherever books are sold. So however your school typically purchases books, you should be able to find it there. And the story is super engaging and doesn't have too many words, so that kids, even with trauma histories, can connect. And then there's an afterword for grown-ups, along with a whole resource library online to help you make the most of it. one of the pieces that I've created that I have found to be really helpful in classrooms are there's some posters around upstairs brain moments and climbing out of your downstairs brain. So those can be ways especially in elementary school, to sort of check in. Where are you in your brain today? Kinds of things. And there's another Riley book coming out next year to help with some of those transitions and model some of the things that tend to be helpful for kids when they are dealing with their downstairs brains.
Great. And I wanted to mention, for the Riley the Brave book, it's illustrated and I know it's geared towards younger children. And there are some real life lessons in Riley the Brave that adults can definitely benefit from. It speaks about trauma and ACEs and empathy and social emotional learning. So even though all the language and all the illustrations is definitely geared towards younger children, the lessons in there and just information, you've done a great job of teaching children about the brain in such an easy to comprehend manner. But even if you're an adult and you've enjoyed this conversation today, I'd recommend picking up that book. I personally have learned from the book, and I think any adult would learn just as much as a child would learn from reading it as well. So your
Thanks, Robbie.
website, oh, you're welcome. Thank you for writing it and being with us today. So your website is bravebrains.com, correct?
Yes, bravebrains.com. There are also it's a little confusing, just to keep you on your toes. There's also rileythebrave.org.
Okay.
And there's a parents corner on there that a number of schools have shared with their parent community that has some free resources as well. And that's where you'll find posters and those kinds of things too.
Great. So I'll share some links to those in the description. And also, I know you have, as you know, I'm a fan of your Instagram. What's your Instagram handle?
At Riley the Brave, RILEY.
Great. And I recommend everybody follow Jessica as well. What she posts, it's very creative and it's very educational. And add her to your Instagram, and every day or a couple times a week, you'll learn a little bit more about the brain just by scrolling through Instagram. So I recommend folks check that out as well. Jessica, before we get out of here, I'll give you the floor. Is there anything else you want to share with our audience?
I just so value what you're doing, and my role hopefully is to be a support to you. There's another book coming out, What's Inside Your Backpack, with National Center for Youth Issues, to keep unpacking the stuff that weighs us down. So I hope you'll check that out. I try to keep as much as I can free to get it into your hands and make it accessible for you and the students that you love.
Awesome. Thanks so much for being here. And Jessica will be, she's presented at several of our past Innovative School Summits, and I'm sure in 2021, we will have her back both on-site, hopefully, and virtually for our, I know we're all hoping to get back to some on-site conferences here soon. So you can find information about any of those upcoming events at innovativeschoolssummit.com. Jessica, thank you again for your time today.
Thanks, Robbie.